Good.
Yeah?
Ready to start.
Things okay?
Things are good. Things are good. Just down to both. All right, it's recording. Okay. Welcome, everyone, to session 3 of our series. And welcome to those online. Okay. So the first 2 sessions, we talked about a lot of fundamentals, really kind of attempt at fundamental messages, themes, values. I'm getting a little feedback here. Hold on. Okay. Messages and themes and values and other aspects of the core kind of substance of this topic. And then last time we spent a lot more time talking about some of the core almost applications of this, right? We spent time on nailing down the number of days that we were talking about in terms of 5, 3, 7, the interplay between Vayikra Kaf and Vayikra Tet Vav, and played out another aspect of that fundamental decision of which aspects of the Torah are going to control in this conversation through the question of what's the ongoing role of tevilah, of immersion in this conversation, given that that seems to be something from the world of Vayikra Tet Vav, which largely disappears from our religious landscape, at least has in recent times. What does it mean for that to migrate over or still be contained in Vayikra Yud Chet? And I tried to lay out for you at least 2 main paths that I thought that played out. One that really sees an aspect of Vayikra Tet Vav as alive and well in the content of Vayikra Yud Chet, actually like the immersion and the real live tum'ah of Vayikra Tet Vav actually still being very much in place, and that the language of karet and indefinite karet very much playing into that. And then the other approach, which talked about the immersion for the purpose of sex as being fundamentally different than the immersion for the purpose of taharot, for sancta, talking about it as Halacha Moshe Sinai, clearly having a different kind of take on that as it being sort of an ancient practice with some kind of unbroken continuity through time, but one that clearly doesn't have the same exact meaning in a world without all the other trappings of Vayikra Tet Vav. What we're going to do tonight, among other things, is begin to get into some more of the mechanics, now that we've made sort of some investigations of the fundamental assumptions, to look at some of the details and how they play out. We'll start in the first part with the fairly famous development, core development in Hilchot Niddah as relates to the conflation of the categories of Niddah and Zava, the normal and the pathological categories of Vayikra Tet Vav. But then we're going to look at another slightly more obscure example referred to in the literature as Poletet Shichvat Zera, which we'll talk about, but that I think is actually another important window into what we'll see generally tonight, which is that my claim to you is going to be sometimes when we see sources talking about a certain issue, they're sometimes actually accomplishing or seem to be accomplishing something different than what they are at least explicitly talking about. That is to say, we're going to see a bunch of sources that claim to be engaging with a set of issues tonight, that if you actually look at how they're really playing out, seem to be dealing with something else. And hopefully that'll open up some space for us to talk about what that is. All right, so on page 1 here, again, I didn't give you Vayikra Tet Vav again. I'm going to not repeat all of that stuff each time, but I flag it here just to remind us of that structure of that chapter and the main content of that chapter, which you'll recall included basically, well, let's just lay it out here. There was abnormal male discharge. There was then normal male discharge. There was then intercourse between man and woman. Then normal female and abnormal female. And again, by abnormal, I mean something that departs from the expected cycle of normal bodily function, where the first category refers to Niddah, the menstrual cycle that one would expect as part of one's just normal rhythm, and Zava is the category of someone whose body is not behaving as expected. Okay? In particular, that maps out with great detail in the Sifra that I gave you here. Sifra is an early Midrash Halacha, an early text that really is attempting to derive or ground law in the psukim, in the verses themselves. I did not translate it for you because I don't want us to get bogged down in all of the details, but I gave here in English a summary of the principles that it lays out, which is important for then understanding how these two categories are going to get conflated. So let's just go over that first to make sure that's very clear. For some of you, this is familiar ground, but I always find it useful to go over these basic categories. Okay? So the category of Niddah in the Torah, again, responds to a normal bodily condition of menstruation, and the Torah specifies a 7-day period of time from the onset of menses that goes 7 days. That's it. Beginning to end, it's 7 days. There are no checks. There are no counting. There is no sort of verifying what is happening in the body. It is a cycle you expect to begin, and 7 days is expected to cover it. And after the 7th day, understood by Chazal to be after the 7th sunset following, we'll play this out in a minute, there is immersion on the night of the 8th day. All right, so what do we mean by the 7th sunset? The way these days get reckoned is even a partial day counts as a day. Okay, so if the onset of menses occurs Monday afternoon, day 1 goes from Monday afternoon through sunset or nightfall on Monday. Then day 2 ends Tuesday at nightfall, day 3 ends Wednesday, and the 7 days would then be completed on Sunday night. The 8th day being exactly a week after the onset. Okay, that's how the 7-day period works. And again, it's a very kind of predictable, round number. The body is assumed to reset its clock, and that's the beginning and the end of the story. Zava is a very different kind of category. And in particular, it's important to understand the rabbinic unpacking of the category of Zava, because you wouldn't derive all of it from a surface reading of the Torah in Vayikra Tedvav, though you would derive the most fundamental elements. The first thing that Chazal do is they say, real ziva, really being in the category of zava, is having 3 consecutive days of unexpected, ill-timed bleeding. They derive that from the words yamim rabim, that the bleeding happens literally for many days, but boiling that down to what they feel is the least number that those words can sustain, which is yamim clearly is more than 1, it's 2. And if you're already describing it as rabim, that implies you're dealing with more than 2. Yamim rabim therefore minimally means 3. And therefore it's assumed to mean 3. Okay? But there is also this subcategory here, which I have under letter A, which gets called by Chazal zavak tana. The notion that there's someone who is not quite in the category of a zava, their body has not gone totally haywire, totally in an unpredicted kind of off-cycle pattern, but nonetheless something unusual is happening that requires some kind of response. And it's based around that number 3. A zavak tana is bleeding for 1 or 2 days. We'll get back to the 11 days in a minute. Not during the 7 days expected for menstruation. All right, so after menses is completed, at another point in the monthly cycle, in the regular cycle, whatever number of days it is, there is bleeding for 1 or 2 days. What happens is then the woman is checking her body the following day to verify that bleeding has ended. There is then immersion on that day, not at night, but on that day. And then the woman exits that state of ziva with the approach of sunset. So just to play that out again. Let's take again a sighting of bleeding on a Monday afternoon at an unexpected time. There then is waiting into Tuesday morning, the beginning of the next daylight hours of the day in this case. To the extent that there is no bleeding at that point, then there can be immersion on Tuesday. And with nightfall on Tuesday, the state of ziva is ended. The same holds if it is 2 days, meaning if there are 2 sightings on Monday and Tuesday, Wednesday is the day that the body is checked to make sure it has reset. There is then immersion, and on Wednesday night, then the status has ended. That's how ziva ktana works. And already you see the notion of there is a checking of the body. There is a kind of making sure that the body, which has been doing something that was unexpected, has somehow reset and returned to normal, which now can't be totally taken for granted. Ziva gdola, a zava gdola, is triggered by 3 days. And 3 days then does not trigger 1 day of checking, but an assumption that the body now actually needs a much more significant amount of time to reset. And here we get into the notion of what the Torah is very explicit about, counting 7 days. 7 days that are free of blood before the body is assumed to have reset. You'll recall this was parallel to the Zav as well. The man who has the abnormal emission in Vayikra Tedvav, also, if the rules rabbinically are different for that, it's not based on days, it's based on sightings, even if he has 3 sightings in a single day. But we won't go into all of those details, but he too has to count 7 days. But the counting of 7 days is, again, the response to an abnormal pathological state. There's something that is unexpected that is going on with the body, and I need to make sure it has reset. Those 7 days are days of checking, of making sure that there are 7 days free of any unexpected bleeding at the wrong time. And until that has happened, and then there is immersion, the state of ziva can remain. All right? Now the final piece of this, and I'll take any questions to make sure this is clear, because you need these details in order to understand the sources that we'll look at in a bit. The way that Chazal calculate when is expected and when is not expected is essentially based on a 11-day regime. All right, so there are, I'm going to just sort of do it in boxes here, okay? And I apologize for those at home who are not able to see the board, but you should be able to get it by listening carefully. No, but they can't see the board because it's too shiny. Yeah. Okay. We need like a black whiteboard. I don't know. We'll figure it out. Okay, so 7 days earmarked for Niddah. Okay? If there is bleeding on 2 of those days, still the entire period is the period of Niddah because it goes by 7 days. Okay? The following 11 days after this period are determined to be Yemei Ziva. That is to say, these are the days when it is expected that there should not be any bleeding. Another way of saying this is, Chazal are setting up a system whereby it is however many standard deviations from the mean to have a menstrual cycle shorter than 18 days. Okay? Shorter than 18 days between one onset of bleeding and the next onset of bleeding is assumed not to be the way a body would normally cycle through a cycle of bleeding. And therefore, as long as the bleeding happens in the 11 days following the Niddah days, these are Yemei Ziva. So bleeding on days 10, 11, and 12, okay, of this 18, this would trigger Ziva Gedola. That would be a sign that, wait a minute, the body is doing something that it is not supposed to do. However, after these 11 days, so we get into day, I'll now mark it here, 19, 20, 21, if there were no bleeding here, and after this instance of Niddah, there then was a break. And the next time that there was a sighting of blood was on day 19, that would trigger a 7-day period of Niddah, because that would be assumed to be the next appearance of the menstrual cycle. Now, this, of course, is a rigid mathematical regime that is being applied across an entire population of human variation, right? So while, for the most part, obviously it will play out, it is actually, in fact, the case that there are very few outliers to having a cycle shorter than 18, you can begin without too much difficulty to imagine the ways in which someone skips a cycle, they're late, they have something that sort of goes off in the timing of it, and suddenly what they kind of know to be Niddah is actually putting them in a category of Ziva or vice versa, right? That is to say, someone who has this is sort of the more normal way this would come up. Someone might have a 40-day cycle, okay? And they might have an irregular, unusual sighting of blood on days 20, 21, and 22. Right? Which, from their perspective of kind of monitoring their own body, is not when this is supposed to be happening. This is clearly some kind of spotting, breakthrough bleeding, whatever it is, right? But vis-a-vis the reckoning of Niddah and Zava, that would be determined to be Niddah, because it's far away enough from the prior menstrual cycle to be rendered as reasonably the next piece here, all right? That problem, actually, interestingly enough, is one of the things that will be addressed by the conflation that we're about to see happen. The conflation that we're about to see happen throws a lot of things into play, which are complicated from a lot of different directions, but at least one of them that has to be dealt with is that question of how are you going to respond with variation. Now, of course, let's just keep in mind, right? The alternative is what? The alternative would be to say something about, well, each person kind of determines their own clock and knows well enough what's going on. There, I think we have to be cautious that it's not so clear how many women in the ancient world could have told you so clearly, I know this is my menstrual cycle and this is not, for all the reasons that we alluded to, right? Reasons having to do with the absence of the pill, having to do with the absence of the kind of nutrition that we take for granted today, having to do with the fact that those things and other things combined, women start menstruating later and regular cycles don't seem to kick in for at least several years, and there is just less of a clear sense. There's also less medical knowledge and terminology to even talk about this, such that that would be such an obvious option. Obviously, in our day, the way we kind of think about both woman's control over her own body, her sense of her own body, the medical language that we have to put around that, the pharmaceutical industry's involvement in the woman's body and regulating it, all give us a totally different kind of perspective on this, and the stuff that we'll see in a minute is relevant. But I just sort of remind you, as you think about, not to take for granted that the possible difficulties of mapping this onto today's world necessarily means that there were the same difficulties of mapping it onto yesterday's world. Okay? Yes?
Mm-hmm. It's at night, and for Zava, it's during the daytime?
That is correct. Correct. And that's an important distinction. Going forward, you'll see. Okay? Yeah.
And also, just to clarify, for Zava, you have to wait 7 clean days, and for Niddah, according to the system, you wait 7 days from the first sighting of blood.
Correct. Let's make that very clear how these work differently. When I have Ziva in these days, okay, I need to be able to check off 7 days that are free of blood in order to reset. Up here, a woman could bleed for 7 full days, stop for 30 seconds before sunset on the final day, go to the mikvah that night.
Right, and so clarifying, day 19, if that's considered a Niddah day, even though it's technically spotting, right? She's waiting 7 clean days.
Well, no. If it's day 19...
I'm sorry, if it's day 18, I'm sorry.
It's already, if it's day 18, but remember, if it's only 1 day, that's day 18, then that will only trigger 1 day of waiting. The outlier case, you can now you're already starting to play with the math, right? By the way, if you know, some of you know this from studying Pirkei Avot, there's that Mishnah that says, right, Niddah v'kinin hein hein gufei Torah, which is basically saying Niddah and the laws of pairs of birds brought as sacrifices that get mixed up with each other and all confused, which is the subject of an entire tractate at the end of Seder Kodashim in the Mishnah. What do those two have in common? They're the math topics, right? Those are real halachot. Gematriot and other things are parparot lechokhmah. Doing gematrias, that's like a nice thing. But you need your math head on in order to do this, right? There's a lot we can say about that. What does that mean? There's a whole, as I said, the sort of mathematicization, the systemization. There's a whole kind of male frame trying to impose system and order on something here that does not have as much order. I know it's only male, but it's also male. But yes, so 19, right, is 18, triggers a whole conversation of, well, wait a minute. This is in Yemei Ziva, but it doesn't have 2 days in front of it to potentially ever become real Ziva. So what do I even do with bleeding on this day? Does it count for something, for nothing? Do I ignore it, etc.? Right? That's already when you start to get to calculating this, some of the issues that are going to come up. Yeah?
I don't know if this complicates it too much, but in this kind of thinking, do they consider bleeding during pregnancy? And if so, if it's relevant to talk about it, when do they consider somebody to be pregnant?
Bleeding during pregnancy is not an ipso facto exemption from worrying about this, right? There may be factors related to pregnancy that might allow you to assign the blood to some other thing that you are not worried about, but it is not sort of an ipso facto exemption from dealing with it.
Whether you're Niddah or Ziva.
You would instill in theory, right? And this is where it doesn't just go by what we call menstruation in the sense of are you ovulating and is that what's going on, right? It also clearly has to do with some kind of regularity. Now, in pregnancy, we know, and they knew also, right, that the bleeding that goes on during pregnancy is already going to be unusual and different and clearly not related to that regular cycle, even if it's happening. We'll touch a little bit more on that kind of by next week when we talk about what counts as evidence for bleeding at all. We're taking that for granted for now, that we can say that there has been bleeding. But what even counts as actually experiencing or seeing that is itself a whole conversation that we'll deal with next time. Yeah, in the back.
Just to clarify, so if you have the 1 or 2 days of bleeding covered, from whatever in that 11-day set, that's the Zava Kitana. But if you have only 1 or 2 days of bleeding that's after day 18, that triggers Niddah even if it's only 1 or 2 days?
Yes, because Niddah is triggered by even the smallest amount. Ziva, which is because it is normal, okay? Assuming you really saw it. This is, again, next week, there's all sorts of conversations about what can be dismissed and what can be ignored. But assuming for the moment it's not something I can ignore, quantity is not a relevant category for Niddah. It's just about, oh, my body tells me it's now the next time, and it's come along, it's light, it's heavy, does not matter. Ziva, it matters, is this stretching out over a period of time, or is this a freak occurrence? Right? Yeah.
Okay, so you give the example of a woman bleeds for 7 days and stops 30 seconds before sunset and starts again on...
No, not she starts again. Just she stops.
She stops, right. Okay, so what if she does not stop on the 7th day before sunset?
Great.
And on the 8th day, there is blood.
Great. So then, let's play that out. You have 7 days of Niddah, okay? Then it turns out the bleeding has not crossed this boundary. Someone who has longer than a 7-day period, right? The bleeding crosses this boundary. Well, then this is day 1 of Ziva. And I now at that point, right, if there is then no bleeding on day 9 is the day of Shimur, the day of the check and validating the cessation. Immersion happens on day 9. And on the night of the 10th, the state is over. What if the bleeding goes 8 and 9? Then 10 becomes the day for that. A woman who has a 10-day period will never be a Niddah in this system and will always be a Zava. Right? Someone who consistently has, well, then it will mean there are 10 days of bleeding, and then there are 7 days of counting, And then after 17 days, there's immersion.
Okay.
Okay? Now, obviously, you can imagine all the way. Now, that itself, let's also add, 10 days is also an outlier.
Right.
That's not usual, but it exists,
Yeah.
right? That's why also some of the conversation about evidence and what counts and what can be dismissed also becomes very important in the conversation. But as a sort of principled frame here, yes, indeed, what is the statement essentially? A body that regularly bleeds 10 days in a row, right, according to this framing, is in a pathological state,
Yeah,
right? Unless I find some way to sort of dismiss or not pay attention to it. But according to the rules of Vayikra Tet Vav, that's how it plays out. Okay? Yes, last question on this point.
Where does the Sikha get the concept of checks from? Why here for Zava and why not for Niddah, let's say, and why it could be
Checks is just derivative from, I didn't even get into what is a check, what counts as a check, but checks is derivative from the Torah's requirement to count. Right? Once you say you have to count 7 days, then you're marking those 7 days. And all I mean by now, I'm being agnostic on the question of check right now. All I mean by check is this day counted as one of those days, which requires some engagement. Whereas here, the only engagement required is, have I stopped by this point in time? And that's it. Once the answer to that question is yes, right? In that sense, there's a check here. It's what Chazal referred to as a hefsek tahara, some kind of stopping, right? But that's it. Because otherwise, I don't care what's going on with the body here. The body will do what it does. It's expected to do whatever it needs to do for those 7 days. I'm not concerned about it. Just need to verify that it ends there, and then that's it. Okay? All right, we'll come back to more of this to clean up other details as needed. But that's the basic regime of 7, 11, Niddah, Zava, normal, pathological, kind of nonchalant marking of time, as opposed to highly concerned marking of time to make sure that the body has reset. Okay? Those are two, right? The advantage of the Torah's description here and the way Chazal play it out is, it's actually really trying to capture the difference between normal and pathological, and it's trying to give some kind of transparent across-the-board system for applying that. That's the advantage. Okay? You can think about the disadvantages as we now see how that system gets totally dismantled. Okay? On the bottom of page 1 and on the top of page 2, we get the first breach in this system, followed very quickly by the second. Someone want to take this source? Read in the English on page 2. Volunteer? Please.
Said Rav Yosef, said Rav Yehuda, said Rav. Rabbi decreed in the field, Sadot, if she sees blood one day, she should wait 6 additional days. For 2 days, she should wait 6 additional days. For 3 days, she should wait 7 blood-free days.
All right, stop there. What is going on here? Forget about where it's going on for a minute. What is this different system accomplishing, seem to be dealing with? Yeah, Tamar?
Well, I was confused about the 6 and the 7. Like the 3 days, that's obviously referring to Zava, right? But the 1 day and the 2 days, the 1 day waiting 6 days, that's saying would be Niddah.
Right.
2 days and the 6.
You would think it should be 2 and 5.
Right.
All right, so there are versions of this text that read 2 and 5. If it reads 2 and 6, yeah, Rebecca?
I was wondering if there's a difference between an additional day and a blood-free day.
Not really. Well, I did that because that's the language. It depends what you think he's doing, right?
There's a distinction between just any days, whether you bleed on those days or not, and 7 blood-free days.
Correct. Well, let's think of it this way. This is the sense in which it might be different. If I see blood for 1 day, what are the possibilities of responses based on what we just laid out? I might do what, or I might do what? Yeah.
If you're in Niddah, you're going to wait, if you see it on 1 day, you're going to wait 6 more days. And
Okay.
then wait for nightfall.
Great.
If you're in Zava, meaning you had your period,
So one way of seeing what's going on here is what's happening. Rabbi is saying one day could either be ziva with waiting one additional day, or it could be niddah with 6 additional days. One day you treat like niddah. Now 2 days, right, the way Tamar wanted to read it was, well, 2 days it should be 2 plus 5, because 2 I would either wait an additional 1, or I would wait 5 more. But there's actually another sneakier possibility, which is day 18 and day 19 are the 2 days. In which case, if day 19 is the beginning of Niddah, I would need 6 additional days. That's the way most explain who have this reading of Rabbi with 6 days. One way or the other, it's clear, treating it as Niddah gives you a more stringent approach, and Rabbi is saying that. Now tell me about 3 days. If I see 3 days, it could be what or what? Could either be Zavah Gedolah, in which case I then need 7 checks, 7 blood-free days, or could be the beginning of Niddah, where I would then only need 4 additional days, right? Or even if I play this game and I say 17 and 18 and 19 is when I saw, then I would need only 6 additional. So there, Rabbi is saying, you treat it like Ziva. Now, there's a lot of contention around what is Rabbi actually assuming, when is he saying this, but the simplest overall picture here seems to be the beginning of a move to saying, you treat any blood like the more stringent possibility of either Niddah or Ziva. Right? That seems to be what is produced by this ruling. One way or the other, you're covering your bases. So therefore, something that might require a very short period of time, you add on a lot. Something that you might say, it's just 3 days of Niddah, you treat as Ziva Gmura. Yeah?
If the 18-19 example, doesn't it seem kind of rigid to separate the two and say the 18th day was like a Zava day and only the 19th day counts for the Niddah count? Because doesn't it, like once the two of them are together, when it, besides for the math equation, doesn't it seem like clear that...
Yeah, unless part of what it's saying is, listen, at the end of the day, 19 doesn't seem so normal either. But if it's really just 19, fine, that's sort of over the edge. But if it already started earlier, we were already suspicious about this to begin with.
Even if there's no stop in between, you don't like after the fact go back and say, well, it's clearly connected. Even if 19's on the end, it's continuing to 20, like, doesn't that...
You might, but it depends. But what I'm saying is, it might not be that the perspective here is a 19-day cycle is totally normal, right? Whereas 18 is completely abnormal. It might actually be tilted more towards the end of, you know what? 18, 19, and 20 are all actually outliers that we're considering not to be the paradigmatic normal, such that when there's any kind of pulling back beyond that threshold, we're not inclined to view it that way. But it can also be driven by the systemization of it and the attempt for standardization. Now the key thing here is, of course, this thing of decreed in the field, sadot. And this has a whole conversation around it. First of all, there's some texts that read things like Surya and other places, and there's other readings of this. Rashi's explanation of sadot, though, is literally women who are in the fields, meaning in places where basically there are no B'nai Torah, and they don't really have any idea what's going on with their bodies. That is to say, one narrow reading of Rabbi is, he made this takana in a place where people were unable to keep track of this 7-11 thing. They couldn't do it. So he said, I have a simpler system for you. All right? It's going to be very simple. 1 or 2 days, you wait 6. 3 days, you wait 7. And what happens? It means that when they see 3 days of blood during a menstrual period, okay, so they're going 10 days instead of 7, right? That's sort of the maximal reading of what's going on there. Now, other readings of Rabbi might be that, well, that's where he was when he made this takana. He happened to be in the fields or in a place called Sadot. That's why I put that in parentheses. But actually, this was like a takana to, in general, begin to eliminate the categories of Niddah and Zavah as functioning so separately and to begin to blur them. All right? I'll hold off comment on why we might do that until we see the next text. But that's the first step towards what's quite a dramatic shift here. Right? To the extent Rabbi applies, anytime 3 days of blood are seen, that means we've now taken a normal period of Niddah and rendered it pathological. Now requires the 7 blood-free days. Some more moderate readings of Rabbi try to say he was actually only saying this about blood in the Yemei Zivah. Only for blood seen in these 11 days was he saying, if you see 1 day there, I want you to wait 6 days anyway, even though you should only have to wait 1. But he was never commenting about 3 days in Yemei Niddah, where for sure you only wait 7 days total. We'll leave that aside because Rabbi gets left by the side of the road because of Rabbi Zera, who upstages him. All right, so just continue now with the next line.
Said Rabbi Zera, Jewish women adopted a stringent practice, and even after seeing blood the size of a mustard seed, they wait 7 days. Rav Papa said to Rava, why did the ruling you reported not take into account the teaching of Rabbi Zera? Rava said to him, I am speaking about a prohibition, and you asked me about a custom? When they were stringent, they were stringent. When they were not, they were not.
Okay. Great lines. Good line to have in your pocket, okay? So, Rabbi Zera. Let me say just a word about what Rabbi Zera very well may originally have meant. And this is from Shai Secunda, who wrote an excellent dissertation on the interplay between the rabbinic processing of the laws of Niddah in Babylonia and Zoroastrian regulations around menstruation at the same time in a parallel culture. Shai Secunda just points out the following. He says that probably the original plain sense of Rabbi Zera, taken as an independent statement, and it's corroborated in the Yerushalmi and in other parallel sources, is a very simple thing. Shiva Nekiyim, he says, does not mean 7 blood-free days. And he says, if you look at that phrase in early Tannaitic literature, doesn't mean that. It means a period of 7 full days. And Rabbi Zera, with the mustard seed here, is making a very simple claim. Don't think that there is a minimum threshold of blood in terms of volume required to trigger the 7-day period of Niddah. Even if one sees a speck of blood the size of a mustard seed, that triggers 7 days of Niddah. Meaning this statement originally, Secunda claims, I think quite compellingly, has nothing to do with our topic of conflation whatsoever. Nonetheless, in the context of this sugya, it gets taken to mean something much more like Rabbi's system, which is to say now, we had 6, we had 7, we're going to make it very simple now. Everything is just going to require 7 days that are free of blood. Shiva Nekiyim very clearly in later sources gets taken to mean that, even though it's not clear originally it means that at all. Meaning, we are going to render every woman, a zava all the time. That's the effect of this, right? Sorry? A zava gedolah, correct. Even for 1 tiny drop of blood, we render the woman a zava gedolah. Now, you should start to feel now that if you actually try to process this along the rules of we're covering all of our bases, it doesn't make any sense, right? The commentators sort of try to figure out, but how could you ever get that? I mean, you're only seeing 1 day. It's only a speck. Maybe Rabbi Zera was trying to tell you, yeah, I'm telling you this because it's surprising. You might have thought you needed enough blood that actually might have come out over the course of 3 days. Even if it didn't, no, you don't. However you understand what Rabbi Zera is teaching, it doesn't actually fit as part of this system, even though it's clearly using some element of this system. The appropriation of Rabbi Zera is using some element of this system to functionally treat all women as zavot. Okay? Part of the tension we're going to see going forward is, well, how far are we actually going to take that logic? How much are we borrowing a concept of 7 days, or how much are we actually mapping all of the world of zavot, all of the world of pathology, onto this? That's part of what's interesting about this exchange with Rava, right? Rava seems to, in his time, to react to this as, I don't know, that's some practice. that some people took on, but that's not actually getting to the essence of the law that we're concerned about. Now, pausing here for a minute. Why would someone take on that stringency? What would that be about? It's not, Rabbi we can a little more understand, right? Rabbi we can understand through the lens of someone getting confused, not having confidence in your average person to maintain 7 and 11-day counts, and therefore doing a classic thing of trying to sort of cover all your bases. But why would you do what the Sugya says this teaching of Rabbi Zera does? All right, so one thing, and this is what some Rishonim say actually, it simplifies even further the thing of even like counting days, thinking about 3 days, 2 days, 1 day. If you see blood, you go 7 days without it. So simplifying, say more about what you mean by simplifying. And it simplifies it because I'm worried people will mess it up otherwise? Or is there some other motivation for the simplification? You don't have to answer, but I'm throwing that out. Yeah, sure.
I wonder if part of it has to do with control, which is, you know, this whole, and we talk about how control functions in the greater system and how, for whatever, you know, for reasons that we explored in previous sessions, this is like a taboo, scary thing. And maybe to have different categories of it is still something feels like it needs to be controlled and not.
All right, so one possible response in the name of controlling, responding would be to take just a very kind of distancing approach. Any sighting of blood, it's going to give me a clear regime of just saying, yeah, 7 days, this is going to make it just sort of rock solid clear how we respond to this. And I somehow remove some of the uncertainty of what day is it, this, that, the other thing.
I wonder why you say distancing, but...
Okay, you don't have to say distancing. But I say distancing in the context of assuming this is also playing out in some kind of sexual relationship and not just in the context of Ta'arot, and even in the context of Ta'arot, distancing from Sancta in some way. But yeah, not to limit it to that. Other thoughts? Yeah?
Perhaps simplifying the educational aspect. This way not every woman has to sit through 6 weeks of sessions on Niddah. She just see blood 7 days.
All right, so in a way, this is, and I hinted at this before, that there is a possible reaction here to, right, it's cast as a stringency. There may be a reaction here to the sort of mathematicization of the process that is laid out in the earlier sources. Now, of course, it comes at potentially a very high price, which is to say this particular regime tacks on 7 more days that otherwise in the context of Niddah would not be there. Remember, a woman who has a 7-day cycle in the Niddah world has 7 days. In this situation, that now becomes 14 because there are 7 days that need to expire after the cessation of bleeding. A woman who has a 1 or 2 day period, okay, that's not a big deal. That tax on 7 makes 7 into 8 or 9. But it can have dramatic effects. Okay? Yes?
The point here is that Rabbi Zera is saying that Jewish women adopted the practice. He's not creating the practice. He's saying that Jewish practice took on. Jewish practice applies to women.
Great. So give me, to the extent you focus on that piece of the phrase, and what would that be about? All right, so if you put it, and I would say actually, right, I would say, because I think this is actually really important. So what you're saying is one very important point. Obviously, others have made this claim, which is the notion of this potentially being a way for women to actually extend the time when they are sexually left alone. And there's actually some motivation there. Is it birth control? Is it about keeping their husbands away from them? Whatever it is, right? I want to also open you to the possibility, taking a little less seriously perhaps the notion that the women innovated this, that you could imagine in some kind of culture of abstinence, men potentially signing on to that for mirror image reasons. That is to say, if you had some kind of cultural motivation to minimize the amount of sex that was going on, you could imagine men signing on to this too. All by way of saying that another effect of this regime can be to prolong periods of abstinence, and maybe that's actually part of the motivation. We don't know, right? If you buy Secunda's analysis of the text here, none of this had anything to do with the motivation. The motivation had to do with something completely different, but you would still have to answer that question in terms of why is the practice maintained over time, right? Why does this not? Because the next step here is, and we won't do it all inside, Rava flippantly talks about this as a minhag, but other sources seem to talk about this as a halacha psuka, as actually like an accepted ruling. And the source in Niddah 67b has Rav Papa talking to Rava and Abaye and just saying offhand, nowadays when we treat all women as fake zavot, as possible zavot, and not just, right, shavinhu rabanan, the sages categorize them that way. Clearly there has been an adoption of the notion that we treat all women as zavot. And here you see the key point about the time of the immersion, because Rav Papa's question in that source is, wait a minute, if we're treating them as fake zavot, why are they still immersing at night? Shouldn't they be immersing in the day? And the fact that they're not immersing in the day is another factor showing us, wait a minute, we're using the language of fake zavot, but something else is going on here in addition, clearly. There is a way in which it looks more like, not really ziva, but prolonged niddah. And the question is then, why would one do that? Yeah.
Sorry, we may have moved on from this, but it occurs to me that the argument, Secunda's argument, if his name's right, that in context here, Reb Zera is saying, this is following up from saying, if you see blood one day, you wait 6 days, if it's 2 days, 6 days, 3 days, you wait 7 blood 3 days. And then Reb Zera says, look, some women have a chumrah. In this context, the way that Secunda reads it doesn't make sense in this particular context.
No, Secunda doesn't suggest that it means that in this sugya. In this sugya, it must be what it gets taken to mean, which is some regime about having 7 clean days, 7 blood-free days that are tacked on. Secunda's suggestion is the original content of what Rabbi Zera was conveying, right? Because here's the major problem. The thing that tips you off that something is going on other than adding 7 days on to the end is when you read Rabbi Zera too hard in the direction of this is about adding 7 days, it's totally unclear why he's talking about blood the size of a mustard seed. Right? That language actually seems to be key to the point he's making, which has to do with size. Which is why later Rishonim, already with the later frame of the Gemara, when they read this, they can't figure out why is he talking about size of a mustard seed? That doesn't matter. We knew that already. Secunda is suggesting actually Rabbi Zera was teaching you that in the first place. We didn't know that already. But then it gets domesticated for other things. Okay? Yeah, Tamar.
I normally would not do this, but I feel like I need to question the reliability of Rav's parents. Like, his claim that Jewish women are adopting this practice, like, how many women does he know are doing this? Like, maybe his wife just doesn't want to get it on. And like, I feel like most of the time it's fair to say that there's like, when somebody is talking about a bunch of people doing something, you have some sense of reliability that they know what they're talking about. But especially in these cases, it's like, how would they have access to that information? And like, anybody could come to any of you guys and say, the ladies are not doing this anymore, and they would buy into it, right? I mean, there's just no...
Okay, but there's one thing that I would expect he would know very well, which is if neither he nor any of his male counterparts are having sex for 12, 13, 14 days, as opposed to 7, that is data, right? That involves the man just as much as the woman. And so to the extent that this is actually playing that out in marriages, I would expect that would be known. But I will say this. That's part of, and again, I don't want to get too drawn into it, but that is part of Secunda's analysis of this source is actually to claim that Rabbi Zera actually never originally said anything about Beno Israel. The editors who domesticated this source here actually borrowed the phrase Benot Israel, which is used in other aspects of Niddah, in order to understand a tradition that they no longer could fully understand. And that's how it got played out here. And in fact, Rabbi Zera was not making a claim about the data of women around him. He was originally making a halachic ruling. Why does he say that? Because in the Yerushalmi it appears, Amar Rabbi Zeora, or it's Zeor Bar Chinana, I forget who it is, a very similar name. Halacha. Isha shero'a tipat dam kechardal yoshevet alav shiva nakiyim. A ruling. This is what, no, most people do this. It's a ruling, and it's about the size. It's about saying there's no minimum amount, right? And that's why I say the ultimate question here is not so much what did Rabbi Zera mean, but why does this play out the way it does, right? So this, I want to see that very quickly now. The Ramban, moving down on page 2, already is saying this stringency adopted by Jewish women was given approval by the sages, and they rendered it settled law in all places. Therefore, a person may never deal with it casually. Asur la'adam la'hakel barosho le'olam. That's very far from Rava's, this looks like a practice, just a custom, might not apply in all cases, right? The Ramban hits very hard on that. And that ends up dominating the entire halacha conversation until today, which is the assumption that, yeah, like if you're going to open up the Shulchan Aruch and figure out how are Hilchot Niddah going to play out in a practical way, you're not going to work with 7 days of Niddah. That's not going to exist as a practical category. You're going to always be dealing with 7 blood-free days. The question that, and that's why I think we have to ask, forget about Rabbi Zera for a minute, wow, how did that happen and why did that stick? There's clearly room in the sources here to try to revisit. The source that best does that is this source on the bottom of 2, top of 3, Galia Masechet, Rav David ben Moshe of Novardak, who says it straight out, right? He says the essence of Rabbi Zera's ruling is not a decree of the sages, but rather a self-imposed stringency by Jewish women. It's clear from this sugya that this practice did not even spread to all places. Therefore, it seems simple to say that one can easily evade this stringency of Rabbi Zera in any situation where there's some other mitigating factor. Now, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach goes bananas on that and says, you can't say that. Even a great man like him, Galia Masechet, we can't rely on him for that because no one else was lenient with this. And then this fascinating tshuva of Rav Moshe, where Rav Moshe Feinstein is asked, and this is where this often comes up in contemporary conversation, what if a woman ovulates on day 10 or day 11? But as a result, which under the Niddah system, no problem. Immersion on the night of the 7th. Sex is permissible starting day 8. Pregnancy is easily possible based on intercourse on days 9, 10, 11. But if a woman is observing Shiv'a Nikiyim and is being pushed 7 days beyond the cessation of bleeding, even if that's on day 4, you're up to 11. And you may have missed the window of ovulation and fertility. So Rav Moshe and many others get this question. And it's this fascinating case where, right, someone want to read this, the Igrot Moshe, with regard to a woman on the bottom of 3, just so we see what's at stake here. Yeah, Alan?
With regard to a woman who, according to the doctor, can only be impregnated via artificial insemination on the 8th or 9th days after the onset of menses. His Honor wrote that there are some who would permit insemination after 17 blood-free days before the next cycle, such that there is no possibility of result.
You understand what that's about, right? If I have 17 blood-free days, then according to this system, there's no way I can be a Zavah. It's impossible. Because I'm already far enough out from the last menses. It must be Niddah. It's one thing to play these games of, oh, I don't know, how long has it been? But if you verify that there have been 17 blood-free days, of course you're a Niddah. So this, right, he's reporting this notion of they wanted to solve this woman's problem by saying, well, we normally do Shiv'a Nikiyim, you wait 7 days, but if you can prove that you're really a Niddah and not a Zavah, of course you shouldn't have to wait. Go ahead.
Followed by waiting 7 days from the onset of menses, and then, if she has stopped bleeding, she can immerse on the night before day 8, following the rules of Niddah and laid out in the Torah. If we were talking about actual intercourse, to permit following the biblical standard and to ignore Rabbi Zera's stringency in order to fulfill the mitzvah of procreation, there is basis for discussion, but I would not permit it in practice, and I do not want to speak about this right
It's amazing, amazing tshuva. Yeah, keep going.
One another in person, we can talk about this in order to clarify the matter, but not as a basis for practical.
Great irony, of course, is this is in writing, right? But I wanted you to feel from that source. I mean, it's actually pretty remarkable, right? You see what Rav Moshe is, if I had to translate what Rav Moshe is saying here, it's essentially the following. On the merits and the substance of the question of Niddah Zava, doubts of Zava, etc., I got nothing. Right? Like, I can't, it's clear. Like, if you've got 17 days and procreation is on the line for a possible, I'm confused about the days, which I'm not confused about, there's basis for discussion here, right? And yet, he will not go there. This is all the more striking in terms of what we'll see at the end of the evening, where Rav Moshe does go to a different place. Now, by the way, I'll just say, I want to come back to you now for the question of why, okay? But what's interesting is, the rest of this tshuva is about saying how, but the artificial insemination is permitted during the Shiva Nikiyah. Right? So, meaning, he's going to find a way to allow the pregnancy, to give the pregnancy a shot, right? But there is this deep aversion, even when all the factual bases have been covered, to actually go forward with this. So this is what I want to submit to you as a question, right? To the extent which I am asserting and compelling you to respond to this assertion, this is not about ziva. It just can't be. It's that the data does not add up to that's what it's about. So what's it about? What is the tenacity here, the resistance to the Galia Masechet, Rav Moshe's kind of inner thoughts here that he won't totally put out? What is the resistance to that that's about something other than ziva? I mean, some issues were raised already, but other points here. Yeah?
Well, just to clarify the question, when it says that the students who adopted their personal given approval by the sages, is that saying that it started as a practice and then the Rabbanim approached halacha and made it halachic, or just that it's completely just some practice and it was just sort of given approval by the Rabbanim?
I think it means more the former. That is to say, I think he's echoing the Gemara in Niddah 67b, Shavyuhu Rabbanan, right? That the sages have rendered women doubtful, possible zavot. And therefore they actually signed up, they owned this. They didn't just say, yeah, that's an okay practice. They actually said, yeah, we're going to actually adopt this as a matter of law. For the Ramban.
The opposite, that started from the Rabbanim and then they adopted it. Right? 'Cause isn't the order?
No, I think the Ramban is saying this may have started from popular practice, but it became enshrined in law, not just by virtue of people doing it for a long time, of actually getting a sign-on, an official sign-on from the sages, which I think he's alluding to that Gemara there. Yes, Tamar, and then, yeah.
Niddah, I know is hard. What is the
Sorry, we should have said that at the beginning. For Chazal, these are all karet. All of them, meaning there's no distinction. The ban on sex in Vayikra Yudchet and Vayikra Kaf is understood to apply irrespective of the 7 or 11 days.
So it seems then like this, it seems an intentional completion of Niddah Zava is like, what's the difference? Like you have, it's not like one of these is less important than the other one. And in the mind of these texts, it seems like they're saying, these are all really serious. We're going to just not trust ourselves to be differentiating between menstrual blood and other kinds of blood. Which I have to say seems to me to be reasonable in that, like, even in this modern age, it's not like there's a, some kind of cosmic symbol. Then we're just going to say, okay, everything is both, and let's just, like, work on the safe side. I mean, I don't agree with that, but it seems
I understand.
that that's how we're approaching these things. These are both serious, and you can never really know which one we're doing, so let's, like, add 3 and 7 and get 10 and move up.
Challenge is, of course, Rav Moshe says, but even if you really know, you can't. But okay, yeah.
I have two questions. The first is like, is the 17 number using here a typo? So it shouldn't be 18.
17 days after,
Days after seeing blood.
right, meaning whenever you finish seeing blood, if you went 17 days without bleeding, you have an 18-day cycle. And once you have an 18-day cycle, you can't be a zava.
That makes sense. Okay, thank you. And then so the second like real question I had is why would you even need to immerse before getting artificial insemination? There's no prohibition of the Torah
Okay, so that goes to a larger question of how to deal with artificial insemination in general. You know, the question of like, do you have to worry about mamzerut and descent and familial relationship issues with respect to artificial insemination or not? Is it considered an act of adultery if a married woman is inseminated by sperm from another man, right?
But I'm assuming you know it's like her husband or the person chosen. But I mean, why would you even need to worry about her state of
No, I agree. In this case, that's clear. It's going to come. In this case, it comes from her husband. In this case, but I'm saying it's sort of a subset of a whole larger conversation of not being 100% clear what the answer is to your question. That is to say, the Torah forbids sex. Is that just about kind of an act from which one gets physical pleasure like sex? Or is it also something about the consequences of sex, which might be achieved through artificial insemination? Clearly, Rav Moshe is playing with that distinction and thinks it's significant enough at least to break down Rabbi Zera. I will point out, though, Rav Moshe in general has a more lenient approach to questions of artificial insemination and taking it outside the conversation of these kinds of questions. Okay? Yeah.
Is it just an unwillingness to go against the previous ruling? Like, I mean, clearly they have cases that they wanted to, but is there just a general, like, want something? And is it the very kind of almost shoddiness of this that makes them hesitant to revisit it? Like, in a way, it's an admonition that, like, wow, you really kind of made a mistake there. And would that, in turn, sort of cast doubt on the whole system?
If the resistance only showed up in the modern period, when there is deep fear and insecurity about the entire project of religious continuity collapsing, I would say you're probably right. In the contemporary period, I think that's part of what's going on with this for sure. Meaning, part of when someone like Daniel Rozenak, who is a gynecologist in Jerusalem, who wrote a paper in 2006 that he published in Hatzofeh, a religious Zionist journal, suggesting this is crazy, is all these 22% of women who are ovulating before the Shiva Nikiyim aren't finished. We got to find a way to go back to the 7 days. He gets crucified by basically the entire religious Zionist establishment, including rabbis way on the left of the spectrum, right? Part of that is a concern about change, no question. But even there, right, that being a good example of what I would say all the more so in the medieval period, there were people that cracked down on him on that are otherwise willing to say lots of other things. And it still does beg the question, I think, of what is it about this that there's resistance to? And some of it has been floated already, right? To the extent that there's a feeling that, well, I don't know. Maybe it's interesting. One of the main responses to Rozenak from some of the more liberal rabbis was, we can solve basically all the problems of this halachic infertility on a case law basis. We don't need you doing this sort of grand destabilizing of the larger rule here. We can basically deal with anyone who comes to us. Now, the critique, of course, in return was, but what about the people who don't come to you? Okay? Which is a fair critique. But what I think was sort of going on there was they were reluctant for some other reasons to get rid of this broader regime that they felt that maybe for the other 78% of the population or whatever it is was serving some useful end, that let's deal with the 22% that has the direct problem, which he's addressing, of infertility. I'm not saying that's the only problem here, right? There's, to me, actually, the much deeper issue with the conflation here is rendering the normal pathological, okay, which is not addressed in that debate going on in Israel. But I think that is, there's something else going on there, whether it's the protection of women's right to refuse sex for longer, whether it's a drive for a more abstinent culture where there simply is less sex, whether it is really about just the fear of ziva but in irrational form. I'm not totally sure, but there's got to be something kind of beyond that. Yeah.
I think what you're getting at here is that it's because people think about sex in general, sex being something that, I'm sorry for the years of because I watch Arrested Elements and can't hear me.
I know, we're trying to repeat the questions, yeah.
It definitely has this.
But you see, now you came, so we should actually continue to make the audio poor so all of you will come in person. Yes?
The idea that there's a Jewish response to sex that's different than a response to things that aren't so emotionally driven, and especially rabbis who theoretically want to
passage on itself is, I think, what you're getting at here. And what's interesting to me about it is that if you look at how the Torah sets up in the biblical area, sets up Tameh and Tahara, it actually is about sex. Sex makes you Tameh, and you can't do ritual things. And making Niddah about sex is sort of counterintuitive because sex itself was the original entire category. So if you had sex, you weren't pure. And now all of a sudden, if you're not pure, what you're not pure to do is not ritual things, but sex. So this whole convoluting of what sex allows you to do and separating sex from religion, so you couldn't have sex in a temple, and separating religion from sex, it's come back on its head. So when you were in the original cultures in the biblical times, you were separating yourself from those cultures by not praying with sex. And then once you're in the Christian and Muslim cultures, now you're separating yourself from those cultures by not having sex.
Right. Now, what the Christian and Muslim cultures are around menstruation.
Very conservative about sex compared to most Jewish cultures.
Right, right. And this is another thing that Secunda says, is he says one element that may be influencing some of the adoption of Rabbi Zera, as we've seen him here originally, may be actually influenced by certain very stringent Zoroastrian practices around menstruation that actually affect the way rabbinic sources even think about it. Yeah?
I'm curious, you seem to be assuming this is a monogamous culture, and I'm curious as to if you're doing that intentionally, and if so, why? Because it doesn't seem to be, in my understanding of the time, it wasn't necessarily a monogamous culture, at least for men.
In the rabbinic period, it is a monogamous culture. Let's put it this way. Rabbis are monogamous. We don't know there is not a single rabbinic figure who has two wives. Now, there are Jews who have more than one wife, but it is not, that's played out in sort of the gymnastics around various areas of law in the Mishnah that deal with multiple wives. But in terms of actual stories or cases on the ground,
One wife or one?
two wives. Meaning rabbinic sources will talk about polygamous situations when they're exploring matters of law that deal with questions of dealing with polygamy.
Right. I'm sorry, I just wanted to break down the category. You're saying they have one wife or they have one sexual partner?
Meaning, what are you getting at with that distinction?
I was just curious. Well, I mean, because in your response, particularly to Mark's question, you were saying that all these periods are periods when people who are speaking are going without sex.
You're asking, do the figures here, are they assumed they might have some kind of sexual outlet in order to deal with it? I see what you're saying. I understand what you're saying now. Well, let's put it this way. There are these strange stories of Rav Nachman and I'm forgetting who the other one is now, who show up basically in a brothel and say, who will marry me for the night? Give a ring, kiddushin, right? You get a get in the morning. That actually triggers a whole later conversation of, well, wait a minute, what if they were in Niddah? How did they know? It's okay, right? Okay, how, and there was actually, it was an article in the Times or somewhere else in recent years about actually this phenomenon in the contemporary Muslim world, about like one-night marriages and that sort of practice, and that has a whole long pedigree to it. But how much that goes on is hard to say. You are right that to the extent that that went on in anything more than a sporadic way, one would not want to explain Rabbi Zera's practice as adopted as having anything to do with men and a culture of abstinence. Agreed. So we would want to be more careful about checking that. Okay. We have like 10 minutes left. Here's what I want to do. I want to just say, outside of the sources here, this other example that I gave you, as a way of just showing you the other issue that comes up here. Okay? We're dealing with a situation now in the new world of Niddah Zava collapse of every time there's bleeding, having to wait 7 days. Okay? So now, remember, before it didn't really matter how many days there was bleeding as long as it was under 7. Now, every day of bleeding makes a difference because the 7-day count only begins with its cessation. Having a 1-day period and a 3-day period under the Niddah regime doesn't look any different. It looks 2 days different under the Safek Ziva Rabbi Zera regime. Okay? The question then emerges as to whether, when do I get to start that count? So the simple answer would seem to be whenever a woman stops bleeding. If a woman has a menstrual period of 1 day, then it should be 8 days. That's the end of the story. Okay? And indeed, for many, in the early part of the conversation, that seems to be the story. Okay? But what happens is there creeps in this notion of, in the world of taharot, okay, in the world of calculating things for sancta, as has been alluded to, the act of sex itself, and in particular the emission of semen itself, is an act that triggers tum'ah. Right? And not only that, but the category that's dealt with in the Mishnah is basically a couple has sex, and then the semen emerges from the woman's body. And it might happen over the course of a few days. And the ruling with respect to tum'ah is, if that emission happens as many as 3 days later after intercourse, that still renders the woman tme'ah on account of her connection to that emission. That is to say, for up to 3 days, a woman, even who is not bleeding, can, on the account of intercourse, be rendered tme'ah, just like the man from his own emission is rendered tameh for the day following. Okay? The question is, what do I do with, what if a couple has sex, and then right away the woman begins, there's the onset of menses. Okay? And there is then a 2-day period of bleeding. Do I say, well, who cares about, the semen has nothing to do with this, it has to do with the taharot, it has to do with the sancta frame? Or do I say, no, actually there's still tameh stuff coming out of this woman's body. She cannot begin the count of 7 days until that is done. All right? Now, okay, grant that that's a potential question you would ask. Okay? What would one expect? One would expect that the result of that would be, you would say something like, okay, so if a woman had sex right before the onset of menses, and we rule that a 72-hour period has to be accounted for flushing all of that fluid out of her body, it could be that in that scenario, assuming she didn't bathe or otherwise make sure that her body was clean, she might not be allowed to begin the count until 4 days had elapsed. Because until 4 days had elapsed, I won't have completed the 72-hour period of the body cleaning itself out. Okay? That's what one would expect a law to look like if it were focused just on this local question of, do I have to deal with this concern? What ends up happening, let me show you look at the Shulchan Aruch here, which is the best summary of this. And I gave you all the sources that build up to it. So on the bottom of page 7, I actually did not translate this because I thought we'd go through all the build-up sources together and then you would just have that as a synopsis. But I'll translate it as we go. Hapoletet shichvat zera bimei sfirata. Someone who, all right, a woman who is emitting, re-emitting, if you will, right, semen during the days of trying to start a 7-day count. Imu toch sheishonot l'shimusha soteret oto yom. That indeed cancels out the count from beginning. Lefichach hameshameshet mitata v'ra'ata achar כך ufaska. Therefore, a woman who has sex and then sees blood and then stops may not begin counting the 7 days until 72 hours have passed, sheishonot shlemot, shema tiflot, because there still might be an emission of the semen in her body. Lefichach eina matchelet lispor ad yom he l'shimusha. Therefore, she starts at day 5. Shulchan Aruch basically says just what I just said. If you're in that situation where those are the facts on the ground, and we've ruled that that's significant, then you'll have to wait 5 days. Okay? Now watch what happens in the Ramah. Haga. V'yesh katvu sheyesh lahamtin od yom echad. And some said actually that she should wait an added day, meaning not just 4 days have to pass till she begins the count, but 5 days have to pass. She can only begin the count on day 6, meaning we're dealing with now a 12-day cycle each time. 5 mandatory days, even if there's only 2 days of bleeding, and then 7 days of letting the body reset. And I didn't give you the reason here, but the reason given for this is maybe she'll have sex during twilight on the first day, think it's daytime, but actually it's nighttime, and miscalculate the days, so it has to be 5 instead of 4. If that doesn't sound plausible to you, just wait. V'chein noagim b'chol medinot elu, and that's the practice in all these countries, ve'ein l'shanot, and you can't change it. V'yesh nashim shenahagu lehachmir od lehamtin ad shiv'a yamim. Then there's some who are waiting 7 days, and then the 7 days of blood-free. That is to say, 14 days. Okay? This is a practice, by the way, the Rambam is aware of this. He says this is total heresy and horrible. Why? Because there's no logic to it that he can detect. And indeed, on this local issue of waiting for the body to flush itself out, there's no way he would possibly get up to 7. The maximum he could get up to is 5. Ve'ein ta'am badavar, says the Ramah, there in fact is no basis for this. Hamachmir yachmir, someone who's strict can be strict. Va'amekel niskar lahakdim atzmo lemitzvah. And one who is lenient gets the credit of coming quicker to the mitzvah of sexual intimacy. Okay? V'yesh shekatvu, this is the really intense step. Some now write that actually it shouldn't matter whether she actually had sex with her husband or not. They might not have had sex for a month, but they still have to wait 5 days before counting the 7. Completely taking it out of the context of this local example. V'chol isha shero'a afilu ketem tzricha lehamtin 5 yamim ad yom shetir'eh bo שראתה בו ותפסוק להתערב ותספור 7 נקיים וכן נוהגים מדינות אלו, and that's the practice here, ואין לשנות, and you may not change it. Okay? Now, why I bring you this example, and again, you have to sort of see it more inside to see all the mechanics of it playing out, but I think it's one of the best examples of kind of setting up the pace, the rhythm, and the counting in a way that is ostensibly using categories that can give it some legal backup, but clearly totally departs from the actual facts that would drive that. Just as I was arguing to you, right, the whole regime of Rabbi Zera is not what you would just get by trying to be stringent for the category of Zavah. This conversation, which is ostensibly originally about trying to figure out how to manage another kind of emission, another kind of flux from a body that is marked in Vayikra as causing Tumah, has now just become about waiting 12, 13, or 14 days. Right? Because irrespective of the context, that's what it basically produces. And the last sources that I gave you here of Rav Moshe and Rav Ovadia Yosef are basically trying to deal with that legacy and try to undo it. And here, fascinatingly, look at what Rav Moshe says here, which he wouldn't say before. And this is a great example of there's clearly something much more compelling to him about the Rabbi Zera fundamental regime than there is about this practice, which the Ramah said you may not deviate from, with respect to going always 12, 13, 14. He says, it seems obvious to me that there was never a practice to be stringent in a case where there was no sex when it would prevent reproduction. Meaning, it's one thing to be worried here when there was actually sex. And I'm worried about the emission from the body of a fluid that the Torah calls tameh. But you're nuts if you're telling me you always have to have a 12, 13, 14-day period when that issue is not on the table, when it's going to prevent a couple from having kids. The practice emerged because now this is an amazing language here. And it's, I think, actually important language for imagining how you potentially, with deference and reverence for the conversation, nonetheless say something that might be radically new. The practice emerged because it made no difference with respect to procreation for the vast majority of women. In fact, it might not have made a difference to even a single woman. It's only in the last 25 years that medical experts have discovered that there are women who can only conceive on a single day near their menses. Perhaps this is a new physical reality, Or perhaps it was always so, but the doctors never knew about it. Therefore, we can't extrapolate from this practice to a case where procreation, which is a significant mitzvah, will be in jeopardy. We should say that the practice never applied in this context. And this is all the more true with respect to a practice that the Beit Yosef was not stringent for, which, right, we saw the Shulchan Aruch himself doesn't even care about that. And that, of course, makes it easier for Rav Moshe. He's got the Shulchan Aruch throwing out the category. It's much easier for him to throw out the ancestral practice of Ashkenaz when he at least has the other half of the halachic ledger to lean on. Masha'en Kain Rabbi Zera, where everyone has basically signed on to that. But nonetheless, what Rav Moshe is doing here, I think, is actually very important, which is on the one hand not saying, that stupid category, I'm throwing that in the garbage, in part because I think he probably intuits that maybe those 12, 13, 14 days were being used maybe even by women in ways that were important, protective, something that I don't necessarily want to completely throw in the garbage. But at the same time, I'm not going to be afraid to articulate the possibility that our understanding of the human female body in this case may have gone to a different place where, to the extent there's already some give and take in the conversation, we may have to reorient where some of those priorities come out. Now that's obviously a tall order to then figure out exactly how to play that out and how to write the tshuva that brings that into reality. But I wanted you to see Rav Moshe's stance here as a way of, even something about which the Ramah says, you may not deviate from this at all, finding a way to say, I'm not deviating, I'm just dealing with a different case than the Ramah was dealing with. Yeah?
Now, I really don't know how to evaluate this decision, but I think this is also a comment from last week in terms of regulation. In sense, like making all cases equal. It's always going to be 7, or in this case, it's always going to be maybe like 11, 12, or 14. Might this be a response to how having a shorter period might make you a better candidate for marriage? Like, this might be, in a sense, kind of a move to make sure that people aren't going to be judging people unfairly because of their period.
Say more clearly. How would it play out?
Women with shorter periods might be more attractive mates, and thus women with longer periods might have a because of their more availability for sex, you're talking about? Yeah.
So wait, so explain, how does this regime, meaning if there's then fewer days that are off limits.
Right, well, by creating a standard for everybody, now everyone's the same, now everyone has the same availability, now everyone has the same shot. But if you, whereas before this regulation, people with shorter periods would now be able to count, let's say have a 9 day.
Aha. Meaning assuming 5 days accounts for the lion's share of length. Let's posit that for a minute. I don't have the data in front of me, okay? But let's assume that for a minute. Then everyone gets 12. Everyone's dealing with 12. It's not this one has 8, this one has 10. Yeah, that's interesting. By the way, that's another way, I mean, linking back to the comment of who knows what about whom and what's going on in the bedroom, et cetera, et cetera. I had not thought of that before, but another factor that might be interesting would be, yeah, having kind of very different dynamics of marriage and marital rhythm based on the human variety of menstruation and length of menses, in a way that this might actually just eliminate that and make it level the playing field, if it will. That's very interesting. And perhaps, and that's another place to maybe look for why it was compelling to those who it was compelling, despite it not following the rules. All right, interesting. Had not thought of it. Yeah?
Could it also be a way to combat infidelity? Like,
Say more. Combating infidelity, yeah. Trying to repeat the question.
First half, I don't know what was talked about in terms of how women speak up to each other. But if that's the case, and then all women in the same community are kind of going at the same time into their period, whatever it's got, then...
Aha, there's no one that's sort of off the grid of the cycle. That's interesting. So, right, we'd have to kind of know how plausible is it of how wide a radius of people would get locked into the same rhythm, and how far the radius of straying by the men is. There's some kind of random walk drunk problem here, right? But that's interesting. Whether even on a very local level that somehow plays out. Okay. There was a thought, a comment over here? Yeah. Right. If you just stuck with the original 7, then you would be okay. I think part of what's interesting about topics like this is, of course, they begin to build on their own logic, which is this may be a sequential, I mean, it actually seems very clearly to be a sequential development. That is to say, there is an initial move from Niddah, 7, to conflation, already in the time of Rabbi, which I agree does not seem to be motivated by the length of menses in any way. That wouldn't be an appropriate way to play that out. But if for whatever reason one moves to the Shiv'a Nekiyim, 7 blood-free days model for everyone, that might trigger a new problem of this sort of uneven distribution of availability, which might then trigger in Ashkenaz some kind of tendency to standardization on top of that. You're right that if our goal from the beginning was just standardization, we never would have left Niddah. But like most things with this topic, I mean, this is really how I started the first lecture, was saying, you know, I don't feel competent or compelled to be able to say, you know, this is the reason for X. And much more what it seems to me is that there's a lot of different inputs that feed this topic. It's true in general of halachic topics, but I think that this one in particular, that is almost certainly going on here too. That is to say, the motivations at each phase here, and is it by women, is it by men, and is it under what assumptions, and etc., are probably not unitary. They're probably not completely coherent in that sense. And that's part of the dance that I think is so interesting about Rav Moshe. And, you know, Rav Ovadia does what you would expect him to do, which is basically to say, you know, any woman, even if her entire family basically follows these stringencies, as long as she hasn't started to follow these stringencies herself, she shouldn't adopt them. And what's actually sort of amazing also, let me just end with this, the redemptive, I think, interesting language in Rav Ovadia, is he's talking here on the top of, if you look on the top of page 9, dealing with a community where it is the practice to wait 4 days and not to allow bathing. Right? According to the Shulchan Aruch, a woman who takes a hot shower has eliminated the problem of poletet shichvat zera. She's cleaned out her body. There's nothing to worry about anything coming out at that point other than her own blood. Right? And therefore, you have a 1-day cycle, you take a hot shower, you're done. You count the 7 days according to the Shulchan Aruch. Rav Ovadia says in Egypt, it's not their practice to rely on that. They were more like the Ashkenaz practice of, no, 4 days, that's it. And they should not unless there is some need. As in a case where the time of her immersion ends up close to her next anticipated menses. Or in a case where her husband is about to go on a long trip. One should similarly be lenient if waiting 4 days will cause her immersion to come out on the night of Tisha B'Av or Yom Kippur. And also, if her immersion would be on Friday night, and she would therefore have to push it off on account of Shabbat observance, she should bathe in hot water and start her count immediately. Why do I bring you all those cases? What I think is important about them? They're not about procreation at all. Right? The cases of need here in Rav Ovadia are clearly about having a functional, more or less available sexual relationship in the context of a marriage, and that's actually a case of need. Now, Rav Ovadia does not say because of that, that's it, go back to Niddah, get rid of the 7 days. I'm not suggesting he says that, but the language, the notion that part of the discourse of tackling this topic is saying, well, actually, you know, even locking people into 2 days of sex when they ought to be able to have sex and they can't. In the case of, right, Tisha B'Av, it's going to come out on Tisha B'Av, so then you're not going to be able to immerse then, and it'll be a whole other day before you can resume relations. That's actually something to be grappled with. That's not just something of, too bad, so don't have sex, doesn't matter, right? And I think that's another important language for kind of thinking through what are the other factors here on the table. So we'll leave it here at this. Next week, we're going to move really to the question of evidence and look at really the fascinating approach of a lot of rabbinic sources to engage and dismiss evidence such that you might not even enter into a lot of these conversations in the first place.